Welcome to the BPM 360 podcast. I'm Russell.
And I'm Caspar. And together we will help you navigate the treacherous waters of the BPM adoption journey. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the BPM 360 podcast. My name is Caspar, and with me today is, as usual, my friend and host, Russell Gommersol. Russell, how are you, my friend?
I'm great. As you know, I'm in Germany, and we've just had our votes. The votes have been polled, and now the government is still trying to get themselves organized. But that was definitely something exciting, but also I think from the whole industry and the whole country, there's been like this, like especially coming out of the winter holiday and then knowing that there's going to be votes in February. I think a lot of business was a bit slackening down. And the craziness of what's happening in America was also something that was putting a lot of attention.
Yeah, I do feel for a lot of people in the United States. I mean, Germany is not nearly as chaotic as the US is right now. So I think
I think it went quite orderly, and it's also to be that there's like a setup in like let's say on the horizon that may be able to get their act together and move forward in a good structured way, to be seen. But so that's that. My hope is also that there's things get a bit back to normal again. But there still is a lot of craziness out there in the world.
Yeah, but I think that's potentially like 1,400 days away, because that's when Trump 2 ends, potentially, if not sooner. But I mean, potentially it could last that long. But that's an interesting part, by the way. And today it's just the two of us, which I always like as well, as much as we have guests, because it's a little bit more free format. But what I would like to touch upon today, Russell, if you don't mind. You mentioned the US. We all see what's going on there with Doge and Elon Musk, who's having a little bit of fun with picking apart or actually tearing apart the public sector in the US. Mm-hmm. Now, I was also listening to one of my other favorite non-BPM podcasts, which is The Rest is Politics. And they were discussing what the consequences are of the US and the UK pretty much backing out of the development aid that they're doing together. And you might wonder, what the heck does that have to do with BPM or with processes? And I didn't think much of it until I heard, in this case, Roy Stewart elaborate a little bit on, well, at the moment that the US and the UK back out of development aid, that means that there is no education support, no healthcare support, no malnutrition support. It's a whole effect of dominoes falling down because one country decides to back out of something they've been doing for the last, well, let's say 80 years or more. And then what hits me, and that's the hypothesis for today, is that if you don't think about the potential impact of a change that you make, you could disrupt an entire house of cards into rumbles.
Well, and that's a good spin to the story. I mean, ultimately, when I listened into these stories, I was also intrigued by the effect, not so much the trickle-down effect, but like the effect is that these institutions have by, let's say, defining a certain amount of money to be like provided for certain aids, that it always has that snowball effect that other countries also jump on the bandwagon. There's other fundings from the private sector that will then also be added to this. So I think the relevance of these institutions to actually move forward and then start providing this aid. The magnitude of what then actually is then accumulates down the lane is sometimes tenfold easily.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you see so the effect there is more around the funding and the effect it has on all these institutions working in a certain direction. From a process perspective, I think that's something where what I think is going crazy is is just to think, assume that certain things are flawed or corrupt and could be optimized, but not understanding the whole complexity that is behind such institutions. Yeah. So I'm not
Yeah.
saying, I know, say the German bureaucracy is definitely not the most leanest in the world. But ultimately, if you do go into the, it's easy to say, and they say, yeah, let's just disrupt it all and break it all down. But the world is just so much more complex. Yeah,
Oh,
and then you
incredibly. Yeah.
combine, say, in our environment, we have like the complexity of compliance coming into. So you cannot ultimately streamline a process down to its bare minimum, because either from an operational perspective or customer satisfaction perspective, your quality will be so bad, or your customer satisfaction will be so bad that it won't work. But on the other hand, a lot of the times you have like guardrails from a certain compliance perspective that you have to
Yeah.
balance out. And to
But
understand that
it's
in a system is something, you can't just go down and cut down everything. You could disrupt something, but you have to do it after understanding these implications.
so the interesting thing what you mentioned, and I think that what's happening, for instance, in the world right now, and especially in the US, it translates really well to what happens with processes in organizations, actually, I would say, because organizations are complex as well, not on the scale as the world or a government, but if you scale it down to an organization, these are complex entities and organisms, and they are structured in a way, and all of the things that happen for a reason, and sometimes those reasons are not logical and not efficient, but they happen for a reason, and maybe they just develop that way. And if you then come in and simply rip out one part, then for sure you're going to have a big impact. And let me just illustrate that, because I think one of the best examples I've seen and actually experienced firsthand is, well, I worked for a manufacturing company for about 18 years. That company, I would be proud to say, and also objectively say, was at the pinnacle of process management philosophy back around 2014, 2015, 2016. And then the executive sponsor moved away. He went on to a new job. New one came in, still very intelligent person, did not have the BPM background, so there was less support. And then the CIO was changed. A new one came in, and that new one had a very clear agenda and target. He needed to restructure and cut costs. And within 6 months, what I would call to be the pinnacle of process management was in ruins. It was gone. And now, 5 years later, about 5, 6 years later, I'm talking to that company again, trying to help them building that back up again.
Mm.
How much, let's say, destruction of capital do you want to justify by simply saying, I need to restructure, and I don't care about processes, we don't need them, we just tear them out.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, sometimes being in an organization, being disruptive, and let's say breaking things down and rebuilding them, maybe on the long term can work out. Not saying
Maybe,
that I really always believe in it, but sometimes you say, okay, we're stuck up so much, we need to really rip down these walls. I think in America we have a different situation because, to a certain extent, there are lives hanging on
Yeah. Oh,
organization.
absolutely.
So they're
Yeah.
saying if the supply chain of medicaments to Africa is disrupted, I'm sure that in half a year you will be able to assess how many, maybe thousands of people or children have
Yeah.
deceased because
Yeah.
of this, and that's where I personally think the disrespect of the people now disrupting all these things is that they obviously or apparently they don't care. Yeah, so
Yeah.
they're so way away from human beings in their own country, if it's poor people, health aid, and definitely they're very far away from anything that may happen in any other country in the world, that it's havoc, and so that's something on a complete level. But if
Yeah.
let's go back to the let's say the corporate world, which is not always more sane, but sometimes it's not maybe so deadly in its effect.
No, that's for sure.
And
Yeah.
so, my impression is here, and this may sound terrible, but sometimes it's the stubbornness of the operations is astonishing. So sometimes decisions are taken, say like in your case, where the process management, which was really on the pinnacle of actually getting the best out of the best of the operations, was just kind of like just destroyed. Yeah. Now, thing is, when that settles, all of a sudden you're going, yeah, but things are still running. Yeah, and that's because
True.
a lot of the stuff that maybe in the headquarters was destroyed, there is like this baseline of people with common sense and a passion for what they do, and they just keep on working. And I've seen that especially with more let's say like organizations that aren't completely centralized and styled through, where you have more like a local culture in these organizations. And they organize themselves. So a lot of the times they're saying, yeah, let them decide up there. They're going to come with their standardized processes and systems. But we've been doing this business for 30 years and we're still doing it good. Now, of course, from the corporate sense that's not good. They're not working according to my book. But ultimately, they in themselves are always self-optimizing. And by that, they are also sustainable. They are not dependent on tell me what to do, but they're actually quite autark. They are capable of surviving, or working, continuing to work independently from any craziness that may be decided on the top. And that's why I think it's always interesting to see, is it so that, say, this real big disruption that happens at the top, a lot of some organizations I've seen that really said, it didn't have that detrimental effect because they were self-sufficient and had a intrinsic organization and sense for what they need to do, and they didn't. So maybe they weren't 100% according to corporate, but they were definitely on a very stable level of working, and that's why I think, and that's why the company doesn't come to a complete standstill, because there's somebody saying, it's not working.
No, for sure.
It
For
doesn't
sure.
work. I'm going to get it out anyway. Yeah.
But then that always would be the balance between how much effort do I need to put in and what am I going to get out of it? And I'll explain that with a little example. So at one point in my career, I was helping to roll out and implement the entire procurement shared services approach that we had at the company. So I was part of a leadership team, and we had to go to every site that we had across the world and basically say, for all your indirect procurement, these are the standard processes, and your local coordination is going to move into the shared service center. So you're going to be seeing a lot of these self-reliant and self-sufficient groups that you need to basically disentangle and take over. And I was I think it was the north of France. We had a site, a plant, and despite all the contracts we had for office supplies, they would still buy their printer ink in the local mom and pop shop around the corner. And then if I go back to what you were just saying, Russell, then you could take one of two paths. You could say, I don't care about that. This is the corporate standard. You need to follow it. That would, of course, have, if you multiply out all these little advantages and gains that you have from that, would still amount to a decent saving. Or you could say, is it really worth, for the 300 euros a year that you spend on printer ink, is it really worth going through the hassle of taking that process away from you and not allowing you to go there? And for a long time, I was on the impression, if you want to standardize, you standardize it completely. But I think there are exceptions to it. And it comes down to, what are the costs? What are the benefits for each of these situations?
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, in a governance sector, I would always think the more standardized and centralized, the better, because I definitely, maybe a lot of, in Germany, the federal system, maybe some people love it, but I ultimately, I don't like it, because I have the impression that the whole it's become more static because everybody's claiming. Not everybody's moving forward and trying to be competitive against the other federal state. It's more like everybody's claiming and sitting there and not really helping to move forward as one. My impression. Maybe some people see
Yeah,
it differently,
yeah,
but you see, and then you have this balance of maybe for certain aspects it makes sense for the educational system. I don't know if it really makes sense to have that decentralized in the federal, federal states
yeah,
and so definitely and definitely say for the police and the police collaboration and let's say immigration and all these topics, a lot of these maybe basic ideas of the laws aren't being enforced because because they don't have a standardized whatever database to collect data on who is in the country or not. Yeah, so that's
yeah.
something where you see decentralization doesn't always make sense. So I think it's the balance there. But
But
coming back to say then this disruption. So what I think is maybe interesting also from a process management perspective is to take that into consideration in your design. So when we're setting up
mhm,
processes, we're setting up the design, and we're thinking about implementing processes. You talked about this hybrid approach on actually establishing ownership and governance
mhm,
in the organizations. And I think that plays a role as well to say, how can we, let's say, not become too dependent from a centralized thinking where we need a local touch to the things. We need a local autarky to this. Now,
mhm.
you were talking about the governance in this context and ownership, but let's take it a level further. Shouldn't that also manifest itself in an open dialogue about how hybrid is our organization, let's say, set up? Yeah,
Yeah,
which
okay.
typically I think companies intuitively have, or due to historical reasons. We always have this example with the sales versus the purchasing versus the finance. And here you have a clear drive from finance, super standardized to consolidate the data down to with the exceptions of the local tax and stuff like that. And then you have the
Of
purchasing,
course.
which is also trying to be more scale into some kind of like global sourcing initiatives, which depending on the industry doesn't always work.
True.
And then you're coming down to the level of sales where they say, yeah, here we do we have key accounts that need to be coordinated across countries, or do we need to go with the game that we have there, also from the supply chain of delivering into different markets, into different channels and different say organizational entity setups. So how do we close this topic? How do we summarize this topic now?
Yeah, well, I think one of the questions is, listening to what you just were mentioning, is very often also the question in how deep do you want to go when you start to document your organization and structure your organization? I mean, we talked about the process hierarchy in the previous episode, and one of the questions I would have is, I mean, we talk about levels very often.
Mm.
How deep do you want to go? I mean, ultimately, and that comes back to the point that you were just saying. I mean, up to a certain level, I mean, level one, where you say, listen, these are my functional domains. I don't think that anybody will disagree. Level two, which is basically just decomposing those domains and subdomains, I think most people will agree. When you get to the actual business process, so let's say level three, or God forbid, you even want to go to level 4 or 5, which at least might make sense in an occasional situation, but normally I would say stay away from that. Where do you stop? Where do you keep pushing for completeness in your description of how you want to work? Because basically what you're doing is you're aligning the organization to make sure that the things that need to happen, the what, is aligned and described. And where do you draw the line and say, okay, and then that's it, unless I have a clear need to go deeper. I
Yeah.
mean, that would be the local flavor that you're mentioning, right? And this is always a question I get, is how deep do we want to go with this?
How deep is your love? That sounds like a
Oh
BPM
God, yeah.
song.
How deep? Well, my love for BPM is just, it's like the Mariana Trench.
Uh, And it's interesting. I just come out of a meeting with a potential customer. Anyway, maybe I said the wrong answer. It's not gonna happen. Let's see. And there, but this was more around the let's say the design phase on before let's say entering also into the build. But I think it's still the same discussion on how deep do you want to go and define exactly how people should work. Now, I think in a design phase coming, let's say, going down to a level of having the key fundamentals of your process interactions, that's something you have to hammer, or else your departments won't be able to work together and you won't be able to have like an overarching, like even controlling in place on how you are performing as a business. But ultimately, then when I think about the detailed processes and how they work, you could say, but it's if it serves the purpose and it fulfills the, let's say, the requirements also from a metric perspective, then who cares? However, again, when you're looking at some requirements, then for example, compliance things, then they will impact the level 4, or maybe even from an IT security perspective,
Sure.
maybe even level 5. But ultimately, coming back to this, like hybrid, like view on the ownership, who is responsible for actually providing that or fulfilling this compliance requirement? Yeah, and here I think to expect that you from a central like headquarter can steer and have like the total control, like on a micromanagement level, that's what's not going to work. So I
Yeah, I agree.
need to
Yeah.
leave the degrees of freedom on how people deal with that in the context of their environment ultimately. So that's why I think on one hand we have the process repository and the documentation, where we're talking about a sound framework that goes down to, let's say, level 3. And I think by defining these very detailed, like requirements, say compliance requirements, it ultimately results then in the levels underneath this to be documented like say with SOPs on a level that are very, very detailed.
Yeah.
Because to fulfill this requirement, which centrally is defined on, let's say, GXP or anything like that, or cybersecurity, in the implementation, if you have then local process owners and experts that methodology wise know how to, in that framework, to then get down to the level of detail to fulfill that requirement, and they need to document it, they need to be traceable and auditable.
Yeah.
They will then fill that space. And that's where you have to then, I say, trust the process. Yeah. And
that's a nice one. Yeah.
Yeah, but trust the process that with that in hand, that they will then on by themselves, get into that level. Now, of course, trust is good, but control is better. Yeah. So you will have your audits and you will have all your cross checks to see if they're fulfilling that. But I think that's where this letting go and letting things happen is something, letting them be self-sustainable in their environment, in developing further. Maybe finding their own local optima is something that I think also from an operative business perspective, super important. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely true. And I think you basically just defined the statement, the one sentence statement for this episode. It's keep calm and trust the process.
Yeah.
And then we add, but controlling it is better. I like that. It's to keep calm and carry on one that I think in England was there for the Second World War. We can do this as well. So keep calm and trust the process. That's going to be our new motto. No, but I do agree.
And maybe it also can just to also round up that picture or that topic from the the beginning around all this heavy disruption happening in America. I don't believe this top-down disruption is something that really always adds value. Yeah. So ultimately, there's how many times have we seen management change and they change for the sake of change? They say they got an incentive to change, but after all the disruption and all the dust settling down and things being built up again, they said, "God, wouldn't there have been a less disruptive way of getting A to B without having to destroy everything?" definitely there's business lines where you want to disrupt the market. Yeah.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
want to you want to go kick ass on that level.
Oh, absolutely true.
But
But
think like this inner destruction on your organization. It say let's go out to destroy the competitors. I'm with it.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
But going in and as a manager just saying it's just kind of like destroy my, what I have, that's what I'm not a fan of. And I think that's what Trump is doing. There's a lot of really, I mean, I saw this one interview. I know we're rambling now, but anyway, I saw this one
Yeah,
interview with this
doesn't matter.
aid
Go
worker.
on.
She said for years where America has been putting boots on the ground from a more heavy perspective,
Yeah,
they've been on the ground with their feet. They've been supplying the medication, supplying the support, and nobody talks about them. They don't even talk about what they've been doing. They've been doing that for years. And now
yeah.
they've been told they're criminals,
They're waste. Yeah,
they're waste. So, and this is what happens in your organization. Somebody comes in and is telling you everything's, crap. And you're saying, well, we've been working 20 years, we've grown, we've done this. I've been here, my heart lives for this company. Now somebody comes to me in and tells me I'm crap and I should be discarded and whatever.
oh God,
What is it?
I personally
What
know
does
how that
that do to
feels.
a company
Yeah,
internally? If I say
yeah,
the market is changing, we need to kick ass, let's do it. Yeah,
yeah.
disruption. I'm
But
all for it. Yeah.
interestingly here is if I mean I follow a little bit what's going on, and you see all the memes and you see all the, I would say, premature and preliminary conclusions that Elon Musk just throws into the Twitter universe or the X universe. And then people start to respond to it and fact check them, and then they turn out to be completely untrue, and or at least not thought through very well. And for me, if I want to bring this back to process management, this really looks like your amateur hour process mining project where you say, I have a very big data set and I'm going to draw conclusions. And then the first subject matter expert comes along and tells you, yeah, but did you take that, this, and that into consideration? And by doing that, the outcome turns out to be completely different. And that's exactly what's happening with this, with Musk and his six little, I don't know how to call them, but hackers, that I think is the best word, but they
Yeah.
have no clue of the context of what it is that they're doing. And that's
Yeah,
very dangerous, even
absolutely.
in an organization where
So,
you do that.
so to close this also, look before you leap.
Yeah, look before you leap and then keep calm and trust the process. Oh,
Yeah,
that's a
exactly.
dangerous combination. It's been wonderful, Russell. It's a bit more political than we typically do, but I think that we kept a good parallel to the processes. So thank you for the rest of politics for bringing us up to this idea. I hope you enjoyed it too, listeners, and we'll catch you next episode. Russell, have a good evening. Thanks.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye bye.